Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Currently, we are in the book of Job. Also, we are in a different section of the Old Testament. We completed a study from Genesis to Esther, and now we're in the books of, you can say, literature and wisdom. I don't know so much about poetry, I always hear that, but more so literature and wisdom. But this is the section where you're going to see a lot of wisdom, a lot of um, uh, not. I guess that Psalms is not considered poetry because they are actual songs, but wisdom and literature. Job is more, you can say, maybe literature part of it. Okay, so we started the book of Job, and I spent a few sessions on that, and I will probably kind of do that periodically in Job. In this session too, that's something I'm going to cover that's kind of interesting that I think is important for us to know, and that is the tactics of Satan. So in Job's 1 and 2, I'll be bringing that out. um, I said that Job is an interesting book in that we get a picture of a man who is suffering. What is interesting about this is that if we're looking at it from a human perspective, okay, you would see a man that you would scratch your head and you would say, oh my God, life is, doesn't get, it's just one thing after another that just kind of, his life just crashes in on him one day. And literally it's going to be one day, we're going to see this in a moment, that his life just falls apart. And we say, well, why? Bad event after bad event happens to him. Evil after evil happened to him. And then on top of that, and people around this would know, Job is a good person, a good man. So why did this happen to Job? Why did these bad things happen to Job? Why did this evil happen to Job? Um, and then on top of that, we get something that we don't normally get by watching sometimes when these things happen. Now, understand, um, in our life, you know, one bad event might happen, two bad events might happen, but the level of destruction that happened to Job certainly was unprecedented from our perspective. Now, we also need to remember then that what we have here, especially in chapters 1 and 2, and then the ending of Job, we're going to see that it is a revelation into the spiritual realm. In other words, what we're going to see is what happened. And in other words, we actually know why it happened with Job. God gives us a revelation to why Job's life was destroyed. Now, what we're left with is, why, God, right, would you do this? Now, we're actually going to get the reason for that as well. We just don't know why God would say he's going to agree with it. And then, of course, in Scripture, we actually are given the answer to that. It's because, one, God is sovereign. But that's not a satisfactory answer, I know. However, nevertheless, it is his answer. I'll get into that later, especially towards the end of Job, because God will explain himself, and then I'll address it at that point. So let's go to the book of Job, chapter 1. I'm going to start back at verse 1 again. Last time we actually got to the discourse between God and Satan. So verse 1 says, there was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of perfect integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 female donkeys and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people in the East. So this 3 verses set up how Job's life. You want to be Job. And he has a picturesque life. I mean, think about this right here. Number one, he's rich. Then he's famous. He's great. He had a great family life. Life was perfect. And this what sets the story up, because it's troubling to us as well as intriguing. Now, let me just say this. Could this happen to us? I'll make this statement here, and maybe I'll make it periodically, and I'm going to certainly make it to the end. But in this, is this something that would happen to us? And here we're going to, I would say right off, no. The reason why is because there are certain promises that we have that if we obey and kind of cling to these promises, then we know life cannot happen to us this way. But anyway, so this sets up a very, very, very kind of, it doesn't get better for this with Job. He was a good man. So verse 4, his sons used to take turns having banquets at their homes. Right, life was good. They would send an invitation to their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Now, I think this is kind of only important for the culture of the time, because remember, women, they weren't really necessarily valued, but you kind of get a picture of a family dynamic here. He said, whenever a round of banqueting was over, Job would send for his children and purify them, rising early in the morning to offer burnt offering for all of them. For Job thought, perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular practice. Now, I think that's, again, everything about this is interesting. So I know I keep saying that this is interesting, but yes, everything about this is interesting. So I also see a spiritual side of Job, that despite his wealth, despite everything, how wealthy he was, and notice that he was also very God conscious. And you could say this is what you would call a godly man. Another person who God would compliment would be David. He said that David is a man after my own heart. And one of the things you see about David is that he continually was God conscious. God word, everything about him is about God. Remember, David was sitting in his palace, and he says the ark of God is sitting in tent. That's how, again, David was always thinking about God. All right, one day, verse 6, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. And the Lord asked Satan, where have you come from? Now, again, we kind of spent the last few sessions dealing with the dynamic of this, Satan coming in the presence of God and all that. So Job's 1, part 1 through 4, we kind of dealt with that. And then he says, so verse 7, the Lord asked Satan, where have you come from? And he said, from roaming through the earth. And Satan answered him, and walking around it. Now that's kind of interesting right there. We give another insight to Satan. I'm probably going to wait until chapter 2 to kind of explore this more. However, notice, because one of the things I want to deal with, one of the things that this shows us too, is how Satan attacks us. Okay? In this chapter, we kind of see the setup for Job. This, chapters 1 and 2. This is the setup for Job, the book of Job. Verse 8. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man perfect in integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. Now, one of the most interesting things about this is that, of course, as I said, could this happen to us today? In other words, is God going to hand us over to Satan today? And my answer to this is no, because of the promises that we have. For example, we know that if in one of the Ten Commandments, children, obey your parents, that you may live long on earth, and that your days may be long on earth. Okay. In other words, and that kind of promises like that kind of gives us again, just a setup. Promises gives us that promise that if we live a good life, life can be good. Now, and Job is very unique, by the way. Remember, this is a unique situation that God, in His sovereignty, is going to do. So he asks Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" In other words, so this from the beginning, God is testing. This is God's test. This is God's purpose for doing this, handing over a perfectly good, righteous man who has done nothing wrong, and for the purpose of God testing testing Job. Verse 9, Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the lands. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, and he will surely curse you to your face." Now, I was thinking about this. You know what is interesting about that statement from Satan? You know how many times that this is actually true? That people do curse God for their hardships. Now, what is going to be interesting is, what's going to be interesting is that here, Job, you could say, would have had cause to blame God. In other words, everything that's going to happen to Job is because God allowed Satan to do it. Another interesting thing about this is, notice that you do have Satan out there on the prowl. And in Peter, he tells us that be vigilant, because our adversary. You know what? Let me turn there, because I think this might be a very good time. I'll get verse here. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Good, sorry. I wanted to go back. First Peter. I think I want First Peter chapter 5. First Peter chapter 5. Been a while since I have been seeing this. I hope this is it here. First Peter chapter 5. Do I got First Peter? Yeah. Elders, true. In the same way, subject yourself. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Here it is, right here. Okay. So I wanted to read this. He says, "Be serious." This is First Peter chapter 5, verse 8. "Be serious, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, is prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for anyone he can devour." And then it says, "Resist him and be firm in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are being experienced by your fellow believers throughout the world." The difference here is that even though we have the promise, and then even here there are sufferings, notice what he says: you can resist. And the word adversary, Satan, the term Satan means adversary. In other words, you could actually substitute the word adversary there for Satan, means the exact same thing. Now, I keep doing this. Let me go back. Back to Job. Job 1. All right, so um, all right, so this attack, I could say, what is different than, for example, what Peter instructs us. Job could not resist the devil. Notice what Satan says to God. On that day, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord asked Satan, where have you come from? Roaming through the earth. Satan answered him, and walking around it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? No one on earth is like him, a man perfect in integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. Right. So this is, and we already saw this, right, in the first few verses. We saw the setup right there. Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and all that he owns? In other words, we know that Satan had been prowling around. He just said, I've been roaming the earth. Peter has just instructed us to be on that, because what? Satan is still roaming through the earth. But notice this here. You put a hedge around Job. I can't, because you put a hedge around him. Verse 12. Very well, the Lord told Satan, everything he owns is in your hands. However, you must not lay a hand on Job himself. So Satan left the presence of the Lord. Now I want to stop before I move on. A couple of things here. So again, this is God's sovereignty. God is sovereign to do what he wants with his creation. And I think we need to understand that as we move on. And as when we even come to the conclusion, when God presents himself to Job, guess what? God is going to present himself to Job as the sovereign God, the creator of the universe. And the reason why I say that is because there are people who, I've heard people in their arrogance get mad at God. I've seen people in their arrogance saying that I would never ever serve a God, yada 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 yada, or I'm angry at God. I heard one minister said he even forgave God. That was Carlton Pearson. I'm doing an actual study on him, a lesson on him. He actually had the arrogance to say, I forgave God. Yeah, he actually said that. But a lot of people kind of feel that way, and it's an arrogance. When something happens to you, when tragedy happens to you, this notion, I can blame God. And guess what? Even if God was behind it, he is God. I often say that in this lame excuse, the room that you see here, I'm sovereign in this room. This is my pen. If I can do with this whatever I want. If I look at these blinds right here, I could say, I don't like those blinds. I'm going to take them off, crumple them up, and throw them away. You know why? They're my blinds. And that is the issue here that I want you to see. That's the point that I wanted to kind of come out here. God is sovereign over his creation. And guess what? All of this, all of us, is God's creation. So if you say, well, why, I don't understand why God would allow, Satan to destroy Job's life. Because he can, because he's sovereign. And remember, he's sovereign over all of creation. All right, I'm going to read this and probably come back and kind of go over this again. But verse 12 again, very well. The Lord told Satan, everything he owns is in your power. However, you must not lay a hand on Job himself. So Satan left the Lord's presence. One day, when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and reported, with while the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby. The Sabeans swooped down and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported a lightning storm struck from heaven. It burnt up the sheep, the servants, and devoured them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. The messengers were still speaking when yet another came and reported. The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them away. They struck down the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when another messenger came and reported, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the elder brother's house. We already know that they used to get together weekly and party. Suddenly a powerful wind swept from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the young people so that they died, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job stood up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. He fell to the ground and worshipped, saying, naked I came into my mother's womb, and naked I will leave this life. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Praise the name of Yahweh. Throughout all this, Job did not sin or blame God for anything. Now, what is kind of interesting about this, remember, in one day, so we know this is unusual in terms of the level of destruction, right? The variety of what hit Job all at one time. Usually, one or two of the other were hit, right? And you know the variety of it, everything from weather, right, to people robbing, carjacking, not carjacking, but destroying his life. So what is kind of interesting is the death of his children. I'll say this in closing out, the death of his children. I want you to understand that God views death in an entirely different way than we do. Okay? And that is not to say that God is not sensitive to our experiencing the loss of loved ones. He created us this way, right? He created us with the emotions, with the attachments. But at the same time, understand that his children are with him now, right? Your loved ones, if they believed, right, are with the Lord, So I again, just keep that again in mind when we understand that. David's child, remember, the one that God judged, but the first child between Bathsheba and David, God said that child was going to die. And David kind of recognized it, even though he grieved. He said, when he was fasting and pleading with God, and when so the servants were standing by, and David was able to look at the servants and said, okay, the child dead, because they were afraid to tell David because he was so diligent to pray and to plead for the child's life. So when the child died, David looked at him because he said, well, what's up? Is the child dead? And they said, well, he's dead. He got up and he started eating. And they said, well, we don't understand. Before you were really going hard praying. He says, David's answer was, well, while the child was still here, I prayed. But he said, after he is dead, nothing I can do about it. He didn't say it in those words. What he did say was that I will one day go to the child, but the child will never return to me. My point is that God views death differently. See, that child was with God. Okay, we'll pick it up in chapter 2, and then I'm going to come back, and then there's a couple of points I want to make about this. But we also remember that this is God's purpose. And what is God testing too, by the way? Remember, Satan said, if you take away everything, he'll curse you to your face. Well, God said, go ahead. And so everything is taken away from Job, and he did not curse God. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. As always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. See you in chapter 2.